I first of all wanted to just welcome everyone to the fifth in our series of workshops. And this one focuses on innovative techniques for student assessment. And I really appreciate so many people joining us on a Friday, and particularly that it might be quite late in the day for some of you. So welcome to everyone. My name's Di McIntyre, and I'm one of the conveners of the Teaching Health Economics Special Interest Group. We are recording this session so that those who were not able to join us can actually view it later. I'd like to encourage everyone to make use of the chat box and possibly introduce yourself, where you're joining us from today, possibly indicate the phonetics pronunciation of your name so that we can pronounce it correctly when we're having discussions later on. And also, please use the chat box to post comments or any questions during the presentations. We're hoping that this would last an hour in total, and there will be time for questions and discussion and engagement after the presentations. And I wanted to just start off by showing you this overview of the issues that we've covered in the workshop series so far. This is the fifth workshop, as I mentioned. We have got recordings of all of the other workshops if you missed any of them, and you can view all of them on the I Hear YouTube channel. Just now, I'll post the exact link to the teaching workshop playlist so that you can go directly there. So, just to kick off, we thought that we would start off by having a poll. So I'm just going to launch that, and then hopefully you'll see it. And we just wanted to get a sense of what type of assessments you tend to use for your courses. And you can select as many as you as apply to you. So I can see people are responding there. So just give you a few minutes to respond to the poll. Okay. I think just about everyone has responded. So you can see, I was going to put the end poll, but can you see the screen? Or do you just see the questions? You can't see the screen. So I just wanted to put up the share results. Okay, here we go. Sorry, I'm not 100% familiar with, okay, hopefully you can see that. So there's quite a heavy concentration there. Unseen exams, quizzes, take-home exams, and assessments. Quite a bit on essays, and some on individual or group presentations. So that's helpful background for the presenters. So I'm just going to quickly introduce our speakers today, and then I'm going to hand over to them. We've got three people who've all been very engaged with trying out more innovative student assessment techniques, and they're going to speak on different issues. But just to briefly introduce them, we've got Neha Batura, who's at University College London. Femi Ayadi, who's from University of Houston, Tear Lake, and Frikkie Booysen, who's from the University of the Witwatersrand here in South Africa. So without any more delay, I'm going to hand over to Neha, who's going to kick off with just some initial discussion on assessment techniques, and then we'll head into the presentations. Neha, all yours.
Thanks very much, Di, and hello, everyone. Thank you for joining. We set up this first poll just to get an idea of people's experiences with different kinds of techniques. And unsurprisingly, very similar to my own experience as a student, there is a very heavy reliance on sort of unseen exams and quizzes, as well as take-home exams or assessments. And these could be written or oral. Given that economics tends to be a fairly quantitative social science, this isn't very surprising, because what the nature of the discipline lends itself to assessments that require, students or learners to have very constructed responses. So either in terms of a calculation, drawing a graph, or a short, very to the point answer to a specific question. Or of course, there are quizzes of the multiple choice variety or true or false as well. There are advantages to these in that these kinds of assessments help us test knowledge in a very succinct way, but there are a few problems that come up in the long term with assessments of this kind. The first is related to the fact that what this encourages students to do is to practice a short-term recall of methods or facts. So in effect, students study for an exam, they take the exam, they finish the exam, get a mark, and then it's done with them, they're done, and they move on to the next thing. Or with multiple choice types of quizzes or practical sets, they tend to focus very thematically on the content of a certain lecture or a module. And the tendency is for students to think about, well, how do I answer this correctly and get the full marks? While that's not a bad thing, it does tend to be slightly problematic because it does prevent us from being able to comprehensively assess whether the learning objectives of a particular course or program are met in the long term. And this is not just a challenge that we as instructors or lecturers or teachers would face, but it also sometimes feels like that to students. The other disadvantage of assessment methods like these is that they don't really help develop critical skills or professional skills. And that starts to become a challenge when students need to translate everything that they've learned in an undergraduate degree, a diploma, or a postgraduate degree in real life in a professional environment when they're either leading projects by themselves or working collaboratively in teams. And so therefore, when we're thinking about developing assessment methods, a lot of the pedagogy around this recommends that we have a range of assessments. So there might be some courses that don't lend themselves to anything but quizzes, but practical exams. But if you're designing an entire program, it might be good to think about how you can vary types of assessments where you could also develop critical skills, professional skills, academic writing skills, for example, structured reading skills for students. And so this workshop therefore aims at thinking about how we could use different methods of assessment, but also think about how these assessment methods are timed during a particular module or over the course of a program. It could be extended to the duration of a program as well. And so now what I'd like to do is hand over to Femi, who's going to kick us off with the first presentation on assessment techniques.
Thank you, Neha, and good afternoon or good morning or wherever you are. My name is Femi Ayadi, as they said, and I'm going to be talking today about some type of specific continuous assessment techniques that I've been doing in my class. Primarily, I'll be focusing on pre and post quizzes, but I'll talk about one other continuous assessment technique. So when I'm talking about continuous assessment, I'm referring to the things you do before the midterm or final. So before I get into that, let me give some sort of background and rationale for why I do what I do by explaining the type of class, my course structure and students. I teach undergraduates and graduate students health economics classes. My undergraduates are in my usual 16-week semester, whereas the graduate students are in an 8-week, which is more condensed semester. However, my students are non-econ majors. They're healthcare administration students in the business school. Most of them are working full-time. My classes are once a week. So one starts at 4 o'clock and it's for 2 hours and 50 minutes, or another might start at 7 o'clock at night. So usually my students are coming straight from work and coming into class. And what I found over the years, I've been teaching at this university since 2005, is that sometimes they've been at work all day and they have never cracked the book, and they just come to class and just expecting me to teach at them. I don't even know when they're staring at me whether they're listening or not. So for me, at some point, I just desperately needed something to incentivize my students to have looked at the material, to engage with the material before classes. So after some time, I started to flip my class. I tell my students, this is a flipped classroom in which I get them to do some reading somehow prior to coming to class. And then in class, we spend it on applying some of those stuff, or me teaching more of the more advanced content. So, but really it was also a shift from making my midterm and finals the significant piece of the grade. So flipped learning, if you're not familiar with that terminology, is really just the pedagogical approach where the first contact with the material and concepts moves from learning in the classroom, group learning space, to you have kind of looked at it at an individual level, thought about it, engaged with it. Whether you understand the material or not is not the issue, but at least you've kind of looked at it. And then sometimes you have some sort of structured activity. And then when we now come to class, it's a little bit more dynamic, interactive learning environment, where it's more like, I mean, I'm still doing some teaching, but I'm really guiding also to apply the concepts and engage creatively in the material. So the important thing about flipped learning, that the first contact with the material, which we always tell our students, even in a traditional classroom, read your textbook before coming to class, but sometimes they don't. And then there's a little bit more time when we meet in class to go a little bit more in depth. And the role of the professor is more of a guide. So I'm going to talk a little bit about formative versus summative assessments, and the way I looked at my class, where this formative assessment, I look at it as a procedure where the teacher is conducting during the learning process, during the course of the semester, in order to modify teaching. So if I'm assessing as I go along in my continuous assessment, I can sort of modify my teaching and learning activities to improve students' understanding. And I think of my pre and post quizzes, which are some of this continuous assessments I do every week, as my formative assessments, where my student is still learning and I'm still giving them feedback. And I think of my midterm and final exams as the summative assessment, where the goal of the summative assessment is to evaluate what they're learning at the end of an instructional unit. And I'm comparing that against some sort of benchmark. So my formative assessments, I think of it as low stakes assignments, low stake quizzes, where the emphasis is on the learning process, whereas my summative assessment is the higher stakes. And in fact, what I tell my students is, these are low-hanging fruits and for my continuous assessments, and you need to be able to do well in that. So also to explain my flipped classroom is I use a learning management system we use in my school, Blackboard. All my course materials week by week is there. And then they have some sort of what I call a guided practice framework, which is basically just something that lists what we're going to do for that week or that day that we're meeting. And it's listing basic and learning objectives for the week, as well as specific assignments they're going to do pre-class and during class. So I have what I call a weekly pre-class assignment. It's like a short assignment, which you'll see an example in a minute, that they have to do. and they have to turn in the pre-class assignment. If the class is at 4 o'clock, they have to turn in. Actually, whether the class starts at 4 or 7, they're turning it in by noon of that day. Of course, they can turn it in earlier if they're at work, or they can turn in it the day before. So the pre-class assignment is something low stakes, just to sort of get them to write like a 1-page or answer 1 or 2 questions about what they are supposed to have read. And then there's a pre-quiz. Once we get into class, I kind of first start the class by asking if there are any questions, and I give them a pre-quiz, which in my class is I use an app called Summative. And the app is just something you can use, Excel or whatever app you feel like, but it's just something that's easy for me. The students are doing it all on either their laptop or phones. And the purpose of the pre-quiz is just really to check the knowledge. It's 3 or 4 short quizzes. I also call it the attendance. They don't have to get the answers correct, but I encourage them to give it their best shot. And then after this short 3 to 4 question pre-quiz, I quickly look at the results of my pre-quiz and kind of I usually would have 1 or 2 short, what I call micro lectures. So the concepts for the day, I'm still teaching it, but how much in depth I get into it will be determined sometimes by having looked at first of all, I look at the pre-class assignments. If they've submitted it by noon, before my 4 o'clock class, I just kind of quickly glance through it online in the learning management system to get a sense of if they're understanding that concept or not. And then the pre-quiz can sort of emphasize that. And then I teach the class or the concept, that I have for the day. And after that, they break up into groups of 3 or 4, and there's a specific question or example that they do to see if they've understood the concept. And then we kind of wrap it up, summarize, discuss the activity or the assignment. And then there's a post-quiz that's usually my post-quiz is the same thing as my pre-quiz. Sometimes I vary, but most of the time it's the exact same thing. And the goal I tell them now is, even if you got it wrong in the pre-quiz, your goal is to get it right. My goal for each question in the post-quiz is for them to get it correctly. So let me also show you my class grade structure. So the pre-class assignments that they're submitting every week before class is 15% of the grade. And it's not, I don't grade it for correctness. I just grade it that you did something and turned it in, but I always tell them to do their best effort. And then the pre-quiz, which we just do in class, is 10% of the grade. And the goal is for them to be there in class, especially if it's an in-class, face-to-face class, to be in class. Even if it's an online class, you have to be in the Zoom synchronous to be able to do the pre-quiz. And then the post-quiz is also 15%. So that's adding up for the whole semester. My midterm and my finals, to be honest, don't even constitute up to 50% of the grade. So midterm is 20%. There's also something I do maybe once every other week called article reviews, where they're reading articles that are relating to the concepts we're learning in class. And then the final exam is 25%. So that's how I structure the exam. So even if you're not a good exam taker, and sometimes my exams can be in-person, closed note. Many times it could be take home, open note, even do it as a group assignment. And then there's some peer-to-peer learning going on there. But both of the midterm and final, you're not the kind of student that just show up for final exam or midterm and pass the class. That's not gonna happen. So just a little bit more detail about my weekly continuous assessments. Is that they have to turn in the weekly pre-class assignments before the class period. I'm not really grading it for completion. In fact, I'm not saying you got this. If I look at it quickly before class and I see that most people didn't get it correct, then I know I'm going to explain it even before we do the pre-quiz, actually, what that is. Or sometimes it's appropriate to explain it when I'm teaching the concepts in my micro lectures. And they use their own device. 2 more minutes. Okay, thank you. Let me go on. So I've talked about it. This is just basically a structure that shows you how, when I look at the results, when I review the results, how much time I spend correcting or going into depth in the material depends on what proportion of the class got it correct. If most people didn't get it right, then that means even though they read and did some pre-class assignment, they still don't understand it. I still put some more time, revisit the concepts, and make sure I hit it deeper in going into that. So here's an example of a pre-class assignment in the 3rd week of class for my graduate students. I just give them, you know, they should have read about price elasticity of demand and supply and all those things. This is the elasticity topic. And then figured out the formula. They might not get it right, but it's there. I ask these questions. Even if they don't get it right, if they turn in something, they get the full points for that. And here is also an example of my quiz. So when we've talked about it, I provide those quizzes, 3 or 4 questions here in this particular elasticity. I now ask the question, they should be able to identify inelastic or elastic demand if they've read something in class prior. All right, I'm almost done. And here is how once the class has done it, the pre-quiz, the red is showing you that the ones they didn't get correct, I kind of get a sense that, oh, question 3 is a little harder, and 4, or question 1 and 2, they sort of can understand those concepts of elastic or inelastic if you look at the elasticity number. And that's it. So thank you for your attention. We will now do another quick poll.
Dee, you are muted. You have
You're
to
muted.
unmute.
I'm unmuting. Okay, so I am launching the poll, and thank you very much, Femi, for speeding up in your presentation there. You were spot on in terms of time at the end. So here's the poll. Hopefully everyone can see it and people are starting to complete it. And we're hoping that Femi's presentation would have sparked some ideas about how one can include formative assessments during your courses. Okay, I think that most people have completed the poll. So I'm just going to press end and share the results. And then we're going to move straight into Frikkie's presentation. So actually it was half at the end. So that's very interesting. All right, so I'm going to stop sharing this so that Frikkie can do his presentation, and then Neha will also do a presentation. So Frikkie, you're at the end of your presentation already. Perfect. Over to you, Frikkie.
Can everyone hear me?
Yes, now we can.
Sorry about that. I'm going to really try and speak to this in 10 or so minutes. This is work I've been doing with a number of my colleagues, and I see Agatha is actually in the meeting today. And it's also a research project about using reflective writing in health economics. Of course, the presentation will be posted later. I'm going to say 1 or 2 things about the pedagogy of reflective writing. I'm going to speak a little bit about what we did in class and how we assess that. And then really I'm going to offer some reflection on what we've done, what we've learned to date, and what one can think about going forward. I'm not going to speak about reflection. Reflective writing, and there are really 3 things to remember about reflective writing. at a more practical level. The first of these is that you write in the first person, which people find very strange. The second is that there isn't the standard essay structure of introduction, body, conclusion. So it's relatively unstructured. But most importantly is that people, A, integrate their lived experience and own experience into their writing, and B, that they also reflect on their learning in the process. We use free writing, and most of you will know what that is. We just use it as a tool to get people to write in a reflective way. There's an entire literature, of course, about reflective writing, and there's a lot of evidence as to the benefits of reflective writing. It supports deeper learning, active learning, critical thinking. Of course, communicative competencies are important too, and it's really, and our students have indicated that it's a lifelong learning strategy. It's not new in economics. There's a couple of published papers on this, and of course, Neha's own work appeared in the handbook for teaching health economics. So I do include all of the references in the presentation for those of you who want to read more. But this is what we did in practice. We had 2 lectures where we had presentations about free and reflective writing. And then we posed a certain topic or theme. For example, health inequality was one of the topics or themes we posed. And then people did a couple of rounds of free writing. It's called looping, when you revisit your free writing, focusing on a specific aspect, a number of loops, and then using all of that free writing rather to scaffold that knowledge into starting to write reflectively and revising that reflective writing. So there you'll see the 2 lectures, 3 and 4, we dedicated some time to speaking about reflective writing and free writing. Their first essay was entirely formative. They had multiple rounds of submission. It was not graded until the final. It was graded, they did receive feedback, but only the final mark counted. And then they had another essay during the term or semester, and there was an essay posed during the take-home assessment on yet another topic, but also requiring, basically these reflective essays ask people to write about 1,500 words, so they're relatively short. Of course, it's important to have tools to assess reflective writing, and it's quite challenging to assess reflective writing. And people use rubrics. This is just an example of a rubric I used last year. So you'll see the rubrics component is it assess context. Can they contextualize that reflection? We do assess knowledge, simply post content knowledge, but the main part is really about reflection and about illustrating personal growth in their learning. And then, of course, one can, or we did also assess writing from a linguistic so-called point of view. Those are just the part of the expert description of achieving those outcomes. So some observations. One thing I realized was that in the take-home assessment, some people reverted to their old structured essay writing practices when they were in the final assessment. Word counts may be restrictive, so you may not want to include word counts or include a rather broad range for a word limit. People asked for very detailed feedback in the formative assessment, and I wasn't sure how to go about that, because on the one hand, you don't want to guide their reflection with your own views and points of view. So there's a find balance really in providing formative feedback as part of the assessment process. Some topics lend themselves more to reflection than others. When I did this for more technical topics like technical efficiency and the likes, it did not work as well as the topic like health inequalities. And what's also important is I realized that it requires me to be a student of teaching and learning. As I go on this journey, I sort of realized I made some, not errors, there are things I could have done differently. So future directions really is thinking about low and high stakes assessments. We're trying to move away from high stakes assessments. In my current assessment strategy, the reflective writing is about 20-25% of the final mark. Students ask for exemplars of good reflective writing. And we need to put those together and in a topic or course context. How do you include self-assessment and peer assessment as part of the assessment of reflective writing? I think that is relatively important. And of course, how you feed that back into your course and curriculum development. And I'm endeavoring to get some of my colleagues to use this in other postgraduate courses. This is, as I mentioned, this is a research project as well, and we will be hope to present at a special session at the upcoming conference next year, where we will share some of our research results. That is it. I can now let Neha present. I'm just going to stop share.
Thank you, Frikkie. Just going to share my screen. I hope that the slides are now visible.
Yes, they are, Neha.
Great, thank you so much. So what I'm going to present on today is the use of portfolios in health economics, with specific reference to one module at UCL on economic evaluation in healthcare. And so first, what I'm going to do is start off with a little bit of background on what portfolios are and why we might consider them to be alternative methods of assessment. I'm then going to briefly explain what the economic evaluation in healthcare module or course looks like, and explain how we use the portfolio to assess the content in that particular module. And then I'm going to move on to talking about the very practical aspects that students need to consider when they're preparing the portfolio, but also what markers need to consider when they are assessing the portfolio. We did do a student and tutor evaluation of how the portfolio ran, and I'll be able to share some feedback from that evaluation as well, and then conclude with some reflections and recommendations. So when students first hear about the portfolio, they ask, well, what is a portfolio? We haven't heard of this before. And the simplest example we can give them is thinking about a photographer's portfolio, an architect's portfolio, or a fashion model's portfolio. It is basically the output of all the work that they have done for a particular module or a longer program. And what a portfolio helps us think about is whether there is appropriate evidence that the students have reached a certain threshold of learning, and then they present that for a review. And in this process, what they're able to demonstrate is either overall progression or the achievement of certain learning objectives. Now, portfolio can be quite targeted, or it can be integrated into a longer module. It can be integrated into a personal or professional development or a learning plan. The key aspect is that it's the learner or the student who really takes the responsibility to create the portfolio, to maintain it, and make sure that it's appropriate for that particular assessment objective. So why use portfolios, and what is the benefit of using portfolios? There are several benefits that we have witnessed, but also that the literature has found evidence for. The first is that portfolios recognize and encourage autonomous learning, and that's actually an integral part of education and as well as professional development. It is based in the real life experience of the student or the learner. And so it enables a better consolidation of the connection between theory and applications to the real world. A very important benefit is that it can help collate evidence of learning from a range of different contexts. And it also enables people who learn differently, who study differently, who work differently, to be able to tailor and demonstrate their own learning trajectory in an appropriate way that fits with their circumstances. This only works if there is a declared framework with very clear marking criteria and learning objectives, as with any assessment. Portfolios also enable a provision of formative as well as summative assessments to learners. And I'll explain that with an example from the economic evaluation module. But as I said, that they can be quite targeted, but also extended to a much longer duration over program and even for professional development courses, for example. So the module that we first use portfolios as an assessment in is economic evaluation for healthcare. It's the compulsory module for students to take the MSc in health economics and decision science at UCL. And it's an optional module for students who take other programs at UCL, for example, the global health and development. We also have a lot of clinicians from the NHS in the UK who are interested in taking this module. And so we have a lot of professionals or people who are outside of full-time education taking this module. There's no prerequisite for this module. It doesn't require students to have an economics background. It does require some knowledge of basic Excel functions. So how to do tables using a sum or an average function, nothing more complicated than that as a prerequisite. And it does require a good internet connection, good stable internet connection that students could use. The module is quite introductory. It's quite a foundation level program that introduces the rational principles and methods for economic evaluation in healthcare. And it focuses on theoretical concepts as well as their practical implications to be able to guide students and create an understanding of how economic evaluation or doing a cost effectiveness analysis can help guide decision-making in healthcare, and also possibly extend that to other sectors. Now, for 2 years, this module was delivered in a very conventional classroom-based environment, and it was quite highly evaluated and appreciated by students. The course conveners, however, felt that because the module was so practical in nature, it was a combination of interactive tutorials, practical exercises, brief lectures, that it actually lent itself better to an online learning environment. And so from the classroom, we moved that module to an online delivery. And it's being delivered online since 2013, just about a year after I joined UCL. So the way in which we deliver this module is that there are online lectures either in the form of a lecture cast. So there will be an integrated slideshow with a video of a presenter, or just a slideshow with a voiceover. And after each video or a set of very short videos, there is a practical exercise that is linked to the content from that lecture or set of lectures. And what it helps to do is to consolidate the theoretical concepts and the threshold concepts that are introduced in those video lectures, apply that in a very practical way to a real life situation. And so what the practicals do is extend the learning that is delivered in that particular lecture. This is supplemented with reading lists that students are expected to read, and we've divided that into essential reading and recommended reading. There are online tutorials, there are journal clubs, there's discussion, and each of the practical submissions that the students do is always accompanied by online tutor feedback. So in practice, the module runs over 2 weeks. The students watch 1 lecture or 2 lectures, do a practical exercise that is linked to that lecture. Then they move on to the next concept that builds on the first lecture, do another practical, and so on and so forth, and until they're able to do a quite complicated practical task. Each of the practicals, they submit their practical exercise online, and then they receive tutor feedback on that. They then collate all the submissions that they've made online, and then put it together in a portfolio. We give them a really clear structure on how to do that, and then write reflective commentaries on each. So I'm going to go into this in a little bit of more detail. This is the information on the screen that we present to the students to help them prepare for the assessment. So the portfolio is highly structured. Students are asked to include the output from all 10 practicals, as I mentioned, include a reflective summary as well as an executive summary. We also tell them what we expect them to write in a particular reflection. And the reflection in the reflection, they might consider things like what they've learned, not just from doing the practical and receiving feedback on that, but also from the lecture that was related to that, how the lecture links up to the practical, what changes students may now want to make in hindsight after they've received feedback or they've done some extra reading. And then once they've compiled all of this together, they submit this on UCL's virtual learning environment, Moodle, which I think many of you may also be using at your institutions. Practically, this is what the portfolio looks like. We've got a very clear outline, and we do expect students to follow this outline. It does also help them structure their thinking. It gives them an outline of what they should follow, and they start to work on it almost as soon as they begin the module. They don't have to wait until they finish all the lectures and the practical tasks. You can see that we've provided a very clear word count for how long each section needs to be. This is an example of a reflection from a few years ago, and this was based on a set of lectures and a practical associated with a costing exercise. I'm just going to leave this up on the screen for a few moments and talk you through what really stands out clearly from this reflection about the students' learning trajectory and what they could have done to improve this a little bit. So they start off with summarizing the aim of the exercise. They focus on the practicalities of doing the costing exercise. They talk about how they familiarized themselves with the data set, how data was collected, and how they've thought about different costs and where they're incurred. They also, in the next paragraph, mention some of the challenges that they face or that different ways of doing the costing may face. And they end with, saying that the theory was clear, and in their calculation, they didn't include a certain amount, a few aspects like caregiving costs or account for inflation. And so overall, this is, we do have marking guidelines to look at this. And this particular reflection does give a very clear idea of the learning trajectory. There's a little bit of criticality in this because the student is able to reflect on what they did exclude. But where this could have been pushed forward is if they had said, well, this is the problem with our cost estimates. If we don't include caregiving costs or if we don't include inflation costs. So the student could have engaged a little more critically in this reflection. So as I said, for the assessment, we do have a very clear marking rubric, and apologies, the text here is really small, but this is what the students have for reference to see what marking criteria we're looking at and how that's attached to a particular grade. There's an individual mark assigned to the executive summary and the practicals. Each of these is marked out of 100. For the practicals, we have allocated 50% of the mark, and for each reflection, there's another 50%. And so the final mark is an average across the components. Clear marking guidelines are available to students as well as instructors right from the start of the course. The portfolio does allow for for a combination of formative and summative assessment, as well as the incorporation of formative assessment of feedback that is received on the online submissions for the practicals that the students do. And we've got a wide range of marks that can be assigned to the portfolio. I've only got 2 categories up here, but they do range from an exceptional distinction level to quite a low failing mark. So there is a possibility to grade across the entire distribution of the mark range. As I mentioned earlier, once we had moved this module from classroom delivery to online delivery and piloted the portfolio, we did do an evaluation of the course and the assessment method with students as well as with tutors. And what students said was that they absolutely loved doing the portfolio relative to having to do a report or an exam, because it allowed them to assess their progress on an ongoing basis. And they knew that their final grade didn't depend on what they got correct in a particular assessment or what they could do in the future and bring on board all that formative assessment. And so, it wasn't a kind of high stakes assessment, which Frikkie also mentioned in his presentation, and it was successful in reducing the kind of exam-related stress that students often experience. They did have bits of feedback for us as well, and they said that what helped them and would continue to be helpful in the future is that if we could continue to provide very clear instructions on the content of the portfolio, and what students are expected to include or exclude, and the level of reflection, so how much detail students should go into. And so keeping this feedback in mind, we always make that highly structured instruction for the portfolio preparation available to students in advance. And we do provide exemplars of reflections from previous years, but not for this particular module to avoid the chance of any kind of plagiarism, but from different modules, just to give students a flavor of the different ways in which people could reflect on their learning. We did also get some feedback from tutors and markers, and tutors unanimously felt that the use of the portfolio allowed them to understand whether a particular student had understood the theoretical concepts and how to apply them to tasks, whether they had been able to incorporate formative tutor or peer feedback and use that in the reflection to demonstrate how their learning trajectory had developed. It also gave tutors a chance to understand whether students were able to critically appraise their own work, the work of colleagues, or critically engage with the literature and bring in tensions and arguments in evidence that is stemming from current debates or hot topics in economic evaluation. Tutors explicitly expressed the importance of having Q&A sessions where students could drop in and ask questions about portfolio preparation and run certain questions about structures, what to include, what not to include, how to reference, things like that. They felt that the marking load was considerably less than exam scripts or essays, and I would completely attest to this fact as well. It takes a fraction of time to mark portfolios than it does to do an exam or an essay. However, it is quite challenging because a portfolio is written from a subjective point of view. And so the learning trajectory that you're reading about is very personal. And it does help to have very clear marking criteria to get around that and to find a level of objectivity within the subjectivity that a student is presenting. Tutors also felt that as they read the reflections that came from the sessions towards the end of the course, they could see that students were starting to develop stronger arguments. There was more of engagement with literature. There was more feedback being incorporated, and students were starting to develop more criticality in their writing and thinking. And so it did give us as markers a very clear idea of the threshold of learning, not just in terms of theoretical concepts that students started off the module with, but how students continue to engage with the different kinds of resources that they were exposed to, and how they themselves then started to take the responsibility for their learning trajectory. So in conclusion, I would say that from our experience, portfolios are about learning, not just from doing a particular task or learning about a particular concept, but also about thinking through that particular concept and how future practice can be improved. It does focus a little more on the quality of what the student has learned. So in-depth learning versus, how much the student has learned. Sometimes very superficially across a breadth of topics. It is, of course, important for the quality of learning to emerge, for the portfolio to be linked with clear learning objectives. The one thing we learned from our experience is to kind of beware of pretty portfolios. Some students are really good at presenting their reflections and structuring their portfolio really beautifully. But on reading the reflections, we found that some of those tend to be quite superficial in demonstrating what students have learned. So there is a balance between how nicely something is presented and how deep reflections are. And so we have to remember, keeping that in mind and the subjective nature of reflections, that it's portfolio writing and portfolio marking isn't a science, it is an art. So students and markers and lecturers should allow themselves time to get familiar with these and really engage with those reflections and think about them when they're marking them. Based on our experience, we've extended the use of the portfolio to 2 other modules. One is fairly applied. It's called Key Principles of Health Economics. It's intended for non-economists, but covers key concepts in health economics. And the other one is the other module that we use this in is a fairly theoretical microeconomics module that has a different kind of student learning body, and it's got different sorts of practicals, but we do find that it works across a range of modules. And I'll
Thanks
stop
very
there.
much, Neha. Sorry, folks, we've run a little bit over on the presentations, but thank you very much. Those were incredibly valuable. I want to just quickly check who'd like to ask some questions. There were 2 posted in the chat box. The one was about how to assess personal growth, and in some ways there was a question to Frikkie, but in some ways Neha picked up on that when she was talking about how they could see the progression over the course of the module. And the other question was also to Frikkie: have you sought feedback from students about the impact on workload and what they value from this? And again, Neha's presentation picked up a little bit on that, on how students have found it. But I just wanted to see if anyone would like to ask any questions, please raise your hand. Or if any of the presenters would like to comment on, I found it very interesting, Neha, that you said the tutors found it really great from a workload perspective as well, and also to be able to see the progression. but from a student's perspective, clearly it's less anxiety provoking, but how did they find the workload and having it spread over the course? Frikkie?
Thank you. We did in-depth interviews with about 7 or 8 students. Our classes at postgrad level are very small. They felt it was extremely fair, a fair form of assessment. There's sort of many other questions that we asked them that I'm not going to discuss them. Unfortunately, we didn't ask about workload, which I think we should do going forward. Just in terms of personal growth, one thing we look out in particular for is to see if they express a change in perspective. Now, how is their own perspective shift in the process or over the course of the semester in relation to the course-related issues and questions? Thank you.
Great. Any other questions? I mean, my gut sense, look, I haven't been, okay, there we go. There's another question, so I'll zip it. Lucas.
Okay, thank you. Lucas from Switzerland, very interesting presentations. And I want to like focus a little bit on the downside as an economist. Like Neha, you mentioned this personal topic that is challenging, and I was wondering about that. If you like having experience with that, do you feel that people sometimes make things up just to sound like what the evaluator wants to hear, or like it's probably hard to assess how honest these people really are, and I was wondering if there's like experience or research on that. Thank you.
That's a really good question, and that was my apprehension the first time someone asked me to mark a portfolio, and I said, I don't know how to do this. I think I'm gonna, go back to the first marker with a bazillion questions. But just looking at the reflection, it's actually really, really clear sometimes that the student has done the work and has understood those particular concepts. So for example, a student might write, in the set of lectures and by doing the practical exercise, I understood the law of demand. What I found challenging is how the law of demand applies to vaccinations. And they'll kind of, throw in a few references here and there, and then say, I found XYZ very challenging about this exercise. So something like that to me would actually be quite superficial, because just to say that you've understood the law of demand doesn't really explain to me how the student has understood the law of demand. By saying that, they're not sure how it applies to vaccinations doesn't explain to me what the doubt is, what their thinking is, what their argument for saying is, that it doesn't apply to vaccinations. Saying that they found XYZ quite challenging with a particular exercise is fine. It does give you an understanding of their understanding. And then we do have these very clear marking guidelines that help you make a fairly objective assessment. And it's this is a really simple example about a particular concept, but we've got practicals where we ask students to look at the Drummond text checklist for economic evaluation, quality of reporting, and then read a paper and reflect on that. And there are some students who really get it, and they comment on the quality of reporting, what wasn't clear, what was clear. And there'll be some students who'll be like, oh, I didn't like this paper very much. And you know that they've completely missed the point of the task.
Frikkie?
Thank you. I think where the portfolio reflects, Neha talks mainly about reflecting on learning. We also incorporate personal experience and reflection on personal experience. And I read many essays where people told me about the experiences of health inequalities growing up. And I can't I can't see that any of those were fabricated but I think when you provide exemplars, you start running the risk of doing that, because you provide people with an example of this is how you reflect on your personal experience. But I didn't find any, any of that in the assessments. Maybe because it's simply so new to people and people are not yet passing on assignments from year to year between students.
Yeah. Great. Unfortunately, we've run out of time, but my sense is that we'll probably have future discussions around these kinds of issues, because it is quite new, certainly in the health economics environment, but it definitely looks like things that it makes perfect sense. It helps students in terms of their anxiety around unseen exams and the transparency and knowing from the word go about how the assessment will work. And I think would encourage students to actually engage and put in the time that is needed. Certainly it was helpful for me. I think it was very interesting, Frikkie, that you spent 2 sessions actually getting people to understand what reflective writing is all about and how to do free writing, etc. I think it is important to develop those skills. And then also the other thing that came through very clearly for me is the need for marking rubrics and being clear about how the assessment will actually be done. But it seems to me that there's a lot of scope for more engagement and sharing of ideas and having discussions about, is it a good thing or not to provide exemplars? Students want that so that they can feel a little bit more comfortable about what they include. Am I doing the right thing? But there are also downsides of it. So I think that it would be really great to have discussions. And now that we've had presentations, we can tell people to have a look at the recordings in advance and then come prepared to engage and share ideas and brainstorm around these kinds of issues. And it's very encouraging to see that some people want to try out this in their courses and modules. So we'll develop more experience over time. But I just wanted to thank everyone again, and particularly to Neha, Frikkie, and Femi for giving your time and sharing your experiences, and to everyone for participating. And just to mention that we are going to have one final session in this workshop series. We're going to have it in January. We thought enough's happened this year and people are unlikely to have the time to attend. But on the 25th of January, Joanna Coast and Lisa Gold will join us to talk about, provide tips on supervising research dissertations, etc. And we're going to do a little bit of market research before that workshop to get views from early career researchers and particularly PhD students at the moment on what they feel is missing in the supervision they're experiencing, what they would like more of, and what they think has been wonderful and marvelous. So that'll be a bit more of an interactive thing, but it will also be sharing some tips. And Lisa in particular has been very involved in expanding the PhD program at her university. So she'll also provide some information from that experience about how to actually help fast track people who haven't done much supervision before. So thank you very much. And also I can see quite a few names and faces of people who have attended just about all the workshops so far. So I hope you have a good break at the end of the year. and we look forward to seeing you next year. Thanks very much to everyone.